If there are no more questions, then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the, one of the topics that I mentioned a few times, but we never really dug all that deeply into, and that is this question of class of social class in this novel. Now, of course, in the remaining part we have of part 3, we have, in today's reading, we have 2 events. We have, both take place on the same day. Bryony goes to see a wedding of who? Lola and Paul Marshall, right? So she goes to that event, and then she realizes she's nearby to where her sister lives, and so she goes and sees her sister and Robbie, who are there living together nearby as well, and visits them and tells them she's going to change her story. Okay. So of course that's what we'll talk about within our homework sheets. But as I said, I want to take a step back and look at ideas of social class. Now before we do that, quickly, a couple of terms that you may have come across, that you will have come across in today's reading. First of all, the scene in which Bryony goes to the wedding, right? Where she's sitting there listening to the wedding vows. It's conventional in, certainly in vows that are spoken in, like the traditional church vows that are spoken in most English-speaking countries, that they have a sort of almost a legal clause that the priest or the minister will say during the marriage ceremony. And this is the part where the minister will say, is there any reason, does anyone here know any reason why these 2 people should not be married? Right? So it's just a pause to say, well, you know, and then someone says, well, yeah, because I'm his wife, or, you know, or something like that, right? He's already married, or something like that is a very common one. So, if you've read Jane Eyre, for example, that's what happens in Jane Eyre, right? Remember, Rochester wants to marry Jane Eyre, and they're in the chapel, and then, oh, sorry, he can't marry her. He's already married. This is a common part of the marriage ceremony, right? Is that these words are spoken. Does anyone here know why these 2 people shouldn't be married, right? And of course, when it's Lola and Paul Marshall's wedding, right? There's this moment where the minister is saying these words. Does anyone know why Paul Marshall and Lola should not get married, right? And it's in this part where Bryony then has this fantasy of standing up and marching down to the front of the church and telling her story about how, you know, Paul Marshall attacked Lola and all these other things. And she mentions that she goes up there like a bride of Christ, right? And this is a term for, a sort of a fancy term for a nun, right? So remember, a nun is a woman who, in the Catholic Church, who's dedicated her life to being religious, just like a priest or a monk does, right? And they're usually called brides of Christ because it's sort of a metaphor of it, like they have, like instead of taking a man as their husband, they've taken like Jesus as their bridegroom, as their husband, right? So they won't have any, they won't get married, and they won't have relations with anyone else. Okay, so that's what that means. And secondly, Cecilia's landlord, or landlady, I guess, has a sort of a bit of an argument with Cecilia, and she refers to Bryony as Lady Muck. Lady Muck. What's muck? Like, yeah, dirt. Yeah, dirt, something's grimy, nasty, right? So this is a term that is used, it's usually more used to women, right? But you can also have a Lord Muck, right? And it's a term that's sort of like, is meant to be sort of like a joking or fake, mocking respect, right, to someone. But it's not respectful at all. The idea is that you're calling them a lady or a lord, right, which is meant to be aristocratic, but they're Lord Dirt, they're Lord Dirty, Lord Muck, right, or Lady Muck. So it's a way of sort of denigrating someone, like saying, oh, you're stuck up, right? What do you think too much of yourself, right? So that's what she says to, that's the explanation of what she says to Bryony. Okay, so as I said, I want to come back to this question of social class because I think it's really important, especially because it's something that is there within the novel, but is very much sort of in the cultural assumptions of the British novel, right? If you, I don't think any of you have taken my British Society and Culture class, but in that class I teach it every fall, and we look at the ways in which social class is very important to British culture, particularly because it's something that is very marked by the British accent, right? And of course, it's difficult, as none of you are from Great Britain, to tell the difference between different kinds of British accent, but there are many, many different kinds. And from the way in which people speak, it's very clear, A, where they're from, right? So usually what city or what region, or even sometimes if you're from somewhere like London, even what part of the city you are from, right? So there are South London accents, there are North London accents, there are East London accents, there are West London accents, right? So you can see that there are very strong associations with place, and also they tend to designate whether you are rich or poor or educated or uneducated, right? So social class in Great Britain is something that is very strongly, very graded in a very complicated sort of way, and it is expressed in a lot of different ways according to where you're from, where you went to school, what kind of accent you have, all of these kinds of things, right? Now, of course, social class exists in every modern society, right? It exists within Korea. There are poor people, there are rich people, there are privileged people, there are underprivileged people. But it's something that is particularly important both to, as I said, to British society and also the history of the British novel. So we've seen, for example, that there is the novel Atonement contains those references, for example, to Samuel Richardson, right, that we talked about earlier. And remembering that both his novels, Pamela and Clarissa, right, those two heroines, the two main characters of both those novels, are both young women who are looking to rise up in society, right? They come from sort of lower middle class families who are trying to find some way to raise their social status. So remember, Pamela, for example, becomes a servant in the house of Mr. B, right? Looking to try and rise in status, and eventually he marries her so that she becomes aristocratic herself. Right? So there is this background that, of course, informs atonement as well with regard to class. Particularly, as we've seen with regard to Robbie, right? We drew the connection earlier in the semester, for instance, between Lawrence's novel Lady Chatterley's Lover, right, which was referred to in the course of chapter 8, in which we see Robbie owns a copy of that novel. And of course, that novel has a sort of similar byplay between the aristocratic and the commoner, right? The actual the lover who is the groundskeeper, caretaker. Now, in particular, and remember I said to you this is a novel that is sort of full of secrets and uncertainties and things that have been hidden from us. And one of the things that's easy to overlook is that history of the Tallis family, right? Because on the surface, they seem to be a very sort of successful and rich and established sort of family, right? I mean, this is 1930s and 1940s. And remember, that time, particularly the 1930s, is a time of the Great Depression, right? There's people who are unemployed. There's people who are homeless. There's people who can't find jobs, who are very poor, who are starving, right? And yet, what do we see in the Tallis household? We see them, they're sending their children to Cambridge, right? They have all these rich meals. They live a very lavish, expensive kind of lifestyle, right? So they're certainly a very privileged kind of family, particularly for the time in which they're living. And so when we look at that surface, it appears like that this is sort of an old money, aristocratic sort of family, but it actually turns out that that is not entirely true, right? Certainly in the generation that we're looking at, right, they are rich and successful. But when we start to look beneath that surface, we start to see that actually there are some sort of hidden secrets and hidden roots of this Tallis family that show something quite different to what we're seeing in this time period. So Cecilia, for example, early on in the novel, we see that she is making a family tree, right? She's tracing her family back through time, who married who and who was born from which family, and right, who's uncle and aunt and grandma and grandpa and all those sorts of things. Right? And the further back she goes, she finds some strange things happening, right? Some things that are kind of unusual for a sophisticated, successful kind of family. So this is on page 11 of your course packet. She had made a half-hearted start on a family tree, but on the paternal side, so on the father's side, at least until her great-grandfather opened his humble hardware shop, the ancestors were irretrievably sunk in a bog of farm laboring, with suspicious and confusing changes of surnames, family names, among the men, and common law marriages unrecorded in the parish registers. Right? So up until her great-grandfather, right? Up until her great-grandfather, who is just a humble shop owner, hardware shop owner, right? She finds the records back to then, but then, well, wait a minute. Where's the records for this? And whom did he marry? And what's going on here? How did this person get here? And who were they born to? And whom did they marry? So a common law marriage means that you don't actually officially get married, right? It means that you just live together like husband and wife, right? And so, of course, this was very common amongst like the lower classes until relatively recently in history. So it also mentions there the parish registers, the way in which for centuries they used to keep the record of who got married to whom was that they would, in the local churches, they would keep a record of the marriage, right? So if you weren't officially registered, if you weren't officially married, then there was no record of you getting married to someone, and therefore no record of like the children you had and all that sort of stuff, right? So the Tallises, even though they are this rich, successful family, we can see even back just like a couple of generations, they are from poor, laboring class background, clearly like low-class people, right? So they have changed their social position in life in recent times. Now, remember, we discussed a class or two ago about like the way the grandfather, remember we talked about the metaphor of the locks and secrets and stuff like that. Remember, it was the grandfather who makes the family money. So the great-grandfather that's just been mentioned there, who opened the shop, it was then his son who made the family money, right? Rebuilt the house that had burned down, and was the source, obviously, of their success, right? This success that has begun to, that has created this family that we now see, right? This privileged family. But nonetheless, they have these very humble working class roots. And we later on in the book, we see Cecilia talking about how even their family name actually wasn't originally Tallis, right? So, it says here, she ridiculed her own attempts at genealogy, right, tracing her family history. The family tree was wintry and bare, as well as rootless. Grandfather Harry Tallis was the son of a farm laborer who, for some reason, had changed his name from Cartwright, and whose birth and marriage were not recorded. Right? So the great-grandfather, there's no record of his birth. There's no record of his marriage. So obviously when he did take a wife, he didn't marry her officially, right? Didn't get married in a church and therefore was never legally married, just what was called a common law marriage. And we also see that he changed his name, we don't know why, from Cartwright, right? Which is a very working class kind of name, right? Because often you'll see that like working class names are named after like a profession, right? Some sort of like trade that you did. So a cartwright is someone who fixes carts, right? Just like it'd be like the equivalent of being a car mechanic today, right? Fixing cars, fixing carts back then, right? When everything was horse-drawn. So they changed their name from this low-class name, Cartwright, to a more aristocratic sounding name, Tallis, only 3 generations before, right? So they're hiding, as it were, by changing their name, by changing their status, by changing all these things about themselves. The Tallis family has created this new identity for themselves, right? This new identity that makes them into like this rich, aristocratic, upper-class family that only 3 or 4 generations before were dirt poor peasants who were laboring in the fields and were didn't even get married in the church. Okay. Now, this is I mentioned a couple of times the painting in the Tallis' living room as one of the examples of the way in which the Tallis' have created this new identity for themselves, but they still don't quite fit into it, right? They still don't feel like they quite belong. Maybe Cecilia and Bryony and Leon are starting to feel like they belong to this aristocratic family, but certainly their father still doesn't, right? Their father still sort of acknowledges their humble background and humble roots. And so we see sort of remnants that are left from the old aristocratic order, the family that came before the Tallises, right? Before they bought this land and before they bought this place, right? Because we see the remnants of the house that burnt down. Remember, we have like the island temple and the fountain and all that stuff, right? And then the Tallis family builds this new modern house, right? That's completely doesn't fit at all the style of the old house and the old surroundings. Okay. Similarly, as I mentioned, the big family portrait that hangs in the living room, right? We have here. This is the description of that room. The effect of suffocation was heightened by the dark stained paneling reaching from the floor and covering the ceiling, and by the room's only painting a vast canvas that hung above a fireplace unlit since its construction. A fault in the architectural drawings had left no provision for a flue or chimney. The portrait in the style of Gainsborough, famous portrait painter, showed an aristocratic family, parents, 2 teenage girls and an infant, all thin-lipped and pale as ghouls, posed before a vaguely Tuscany is in Italy. Tuscan landscape. No one knew who these people were, but it was likely that Harry Tallis thought that they would lend an impression of solidity to his household, right? So their grandfather buys this painting, right? Puts up this painting in the living room. It's like, there's a family. This painting is expensive, right? Who are they? Oh, I don't know. But it looks traditional. Makes us look like, we belong, right? So they sort of create this fake tradition, fake position for themselves as this upper class family but in reality, like they don't really quite fit this new image that they have created for themselves as a family. Now, this is particularly important because we see that Emily Tallis in particular is someone who turns, well, she doesn't even turn against Robbie. She was never on Robbie's side in the first place, right? Remember, she's kind of a snob, right? We see it in the way in which she thinks about her own daughter. Like, you know, her daughter, she wants her to just get married. She doesn't like care about all this newfangled feminist stuff that she's been doing. She doesn't care about literature. She just wants her daughter to follow a conservative, traditional role of women, right, as she sees it. Emily is against helping Robbie from the outset, right? She's like, well, but we're an aristocratic family. Why would we help this, you know, this lower class boy, right? Can't he go on his own scholarship to Cambridge, right? Why should we help him, right? Now, of course, now that we know more about the Tallis family, now that we know that they themselves come from this low-class background, there's a certain irony in the way in which Emily looks down upon Robbie, and in fact, how the whole family even turns against Robbie, because they look down upon him. Oh, of course he would betray us. Of course he would like show his low-class roots. Of course he would show that he is like, you know, beneath us. But the fact is that they as well, right, not too long ago were in the same position as Robbie, right? That they themselves have only recently become rich and successful, and yet they pretend like they have been these aristocrats in this, you know, this rich family for so long. So, you know, I would imagine that Emily might have a slightly different perspective on things if she was called like Emily Cartwright instead of Emily Tallis, right? So, as I mentioned, the father, though, Jack, right, Jack Tallis, is someone who seems to still have some sort of recognition of the fact that his family have risen from these humble origins, right? That he knows that he wasn't just simply born into this money, that it's something that his family had to rise up out of its own laboring class origins to become this. And that seems to be part of why he goes against his wife and he champions Robbie, right, as it says there. But really, and this is Emily's thoughts, remember, this is from chapter 12, but really he was a hobby of Jack's, living proof of some leveling principle he had pursued through the years, right? So even though Jack is high class, he's upper class, he's successful, nonetheless, he has this kind of democratic, egalitarian approach to people, right? That seems to come from his own family background, from a realization that he himself was originally from these humble roots. Okay. Now finally, this is not something that's mentioned directly by McEwan, but we've mentioned there are a number of different ways in which atonement echoes many of the famous novels from the British tradition. And another echo here, even though it's not mentioned directly, is that of Thomas Hardy's famous novel, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which also looks at the way in which the aristocracy has changed, fallen, and that this is also another one of those novels that involves not only looking at class issues, but also as part of its major storyline, just like Clarissa has a rape that is a central part of the story that's told. So in that particular story, you know, one of the things that rich people could do in the 19th century, and maybe they can still do it now, I'm not sure, is that they could, if they started out low class and poor and then became rich, they could buy titles to a family name, right? So they could, you know, they could be like, oh, I want to be, let's say, I want to be Lord Muck, right? And so I could go to the government and I could pay to become Lord Muck, right? And I could buy those titles, and I would change my name from Matthews to Muck, and you could all call me Sir Peter Muck, right? Or Lord Muck. And right? This is what people could do with their money as a way of sort of like giving your family sort of some sort of glory and sort of prestige by simply buying it rather than by earning it through, or having it handed down to you rather by tradition. So this is what happens in the novel, is that like one of these families that does this buys the name of d'Urberville, moves to this area, right? And then at the same time, the family that used to be called d'Urberville, right, they've long since lost their aristocratic status. They've become peasants, and their name has been corrupted from d'Urberville down to the ordinary name Derbyfield, right? And they only just find this out at the beginning of the novel, right? And so they send their daughter Tess to this new family, and the so-called like real d'Urberville, who he's not at all, he's just bought this name, ends up taking advantage of her, right? And he rapes her. And so, as I said, there are these echoes, right? These echoes across these different novels, from Richardson to D.H. Lawrence to Virginia Woolf, and again here to Thomas Hardy, that go through all the way through Atonement, that we see is a very important part of the way in which McEwan presents this novel as being a product of this tradition, right? Being a product of these other earlier British novels that have influenced the structure of this one. Okay, so remember, please take away those the notes that I gave you about the the midterm exam rather. Remember, you are allowed to prepare. You're allowed to be ready. You're allowed to know what quotes and what structure and what ideas you're going to have, but you must prepare in order to be able to write the actual test in test conditions. All right. Again, if you need any help from me, please do let me know. Send me an email. Talk to me. Set up an appointment if you want to, or email me your notes and I'll be happy to look them over. But otherwise, I will see you on Thursday. Thank you guys. I'll see you then. Thank you.